as normal childhood illnesses, namely attention deficit disorder, recurring viral infections, and finally childhood onset migraines. We had asked for a CAT scan to make sure that none of these problems were being caused by the same thing, and were quickly denied it for the expense of it, and were told that there was nothing neurologically wrong that would recommend it. Whoops, that was a, sorry. Oh, I went all the way to the end. I went all the way to the end. There we go. Next one. There we go. So after he was diagnosed with childhood onset migraines, 3 weeks later he woke up in the middle of the night with another one. We gave him his medication and were told that fever might accompany it, which it did, and gave him the Motrin. But a couple hours later I realized that he wasn't being very responsive. So we rushed him over to the pediatrics office, where they thought that he had spinal meningitis. They called paramedics and he was rushed off to Children's Hospital in San Diego. Unfortunately, he went downhill very rapidly once he got there, and what we didn't know, nor did his doctors know, was that he was having an Addisonian crisis. So he was kept in a medicated coma for about a week, and it was about 12 days later that we were finally given the accurate diagnosis of adrenal leukodystrophy. We were told that he was too far progressed to have a bone marrow transplant, and that there was really no viable treatment that could slow the progression of the disease. Unfortunately, we thought that, or fortunately, we had hope, and we thought that there was something that we could maybe find through other doctors that were more familiar with the disease. But every referral that we got took a month to get the referral, then another month to get the appointment, and we watched him go downhill very rapidly. And as I was taking him to all these specialists, I realized that I knew more about ALD than they did, because I spent all my evenings on the internet learning as much as I could and calling the specialists from around the U.S. that could help me. So within the first month and a half of his diagnosis, we realized that bone marrow transplant really was not going to be an option for us. So we decided to make as many family memories as we could. So we took him to Mexico because he loved the water, he loved boogie boarding. He got to being the ring bearer in his stepsister's wedding. He was so happy to be able to wear that suit, even though he was in need of help to get down the aisle. He was losing his vision pretty rapidly at that point. And the bottom picture was when Make-A-Wish sent us to Hawaii, and that was a very memorable trip, but a very difficult one for him. And he passed away on September 30th. So my motivation was because there were many signs that pointed to ALD, and none of his doctors were picking up on it, that I figured that I needed to start a foundation that would spread awareness about this disease. So shortly after we lost Sawyer, I enrolled in a couple classes at the local university, community college, so I could learn how to put a website together and put my brochures together that would help me with educating information. I wasn't really sure how I was going to do it. So after I got these things in place, then I decided to go to the continuing medical education conferences and exhibit in the trade shows and hand out as many brochures and engage as many physicians and nurses in conversation about ALD as I could. Well, after doing that for about 5 years, I realized that many of the students coming right out of medical school still had not even heard of ALD, as well as many endocrinologists and pediatricians. So my husband and I started powwowing about what could we do to make a bigger impact and have a bigger voice and get this message out to more physicians. So I kind of decided that maybe going to children's hospitals and making sure that the emergency rooms, number one, had the information, the endocrinologists and the pediatricians. So we got a big wall map of the U.S. and I mapped out 215 children's hospitals that I found through the website and set our plan in motion. We got the RV donated, and this is kind of one of those things where be careful what you wish for because the next thing I knew, I was hitting the road. I spent my first week in Southern California trying just kind of test testing the waters and test driving the RV, and realized that as I was going to the children's hospitals, I was actually passing pediatric clinics and family practices and other hospitals that had pediatrics, but just didn't have a children's hospital attached. So I went back home and went back to the drawing board and started adding those facilities as well. Oh, let's skip ahead. But anyway, so after 5 years, instead of a 7-month trip, I ended up going to over 3,200 medical facilities in all 48 lower states and put about 44,000 miles on my RV. And educated many, many people along the way. As one news station defined it, I was educating doctors 1 mile at a time. So what I learned along the way is that telling my personal story really affects the physicians and makes them a little more interested in what it is that I have to say, as well as listening to the educational information that I distribute. And a lot of the physicians that are not familiar with the disease, it's harder to get them engaged in conversation. But if it's a doctor who has had a patient, especially if they've lost a patient, they're really wanting to come and talk to me and find out what we've learned over the last 5-10 years about this disease, as well as where we're heading with newborn screening. And as Greg said, I was instrumental with them in testifying to the Senate and the Assembly in getting newborn screening approved in the state of California. We also testified to the Secretary's Advisory Committee and finally got it added to the RUSP, the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, in September. And that is my talk, and thank you again for your time.